All right, folks, pages 2 through 6. So page 2 is railroads and industry in the Gilded Age. When they challenged the railroad companies to the workers, the 1877 strikers confronted the largest, most powerful corporations Americans had ever known, a symbol of both progress and peril. To them, it was bringing us into the modern age, but also taking away their freedom, their liberty, their independence, and their standard of living. So it was a symbol of progress and peril, good and bad. The railroad spurred rapid and far-reaching changes in post-Civil War American society. Truth be told, if Abe Lincoln had come back to life 15 years after he was assassinated, he wouldn't have recognized the country he came back to. So, supported by government funds, railroad building boomed after the Civil War. There were only 2,000 miles of track in 1850, but by 1877 there were nearly 80,000 miles in use. Railroad owners controlled tens of thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars in assets in that money, not today's money. Companies such as the Baltimore and Ohio or the B&O Railroad bought coal mines, built iron mills, and consumed whole forests. Larger than some state governments, the railroads pioneered the form of the modern corporation. Crossing the wilderness, carrying people and freight, at unheard of speeds, the railroads changed the ways Americans thought and lived. As distant cities and towns were linked together, Americans increasingly identified themselves as citizens of a whole nation, not merely a single state. So we began to become more like each other. We can get to each other quicker and buy things more similar to each other. For the first time, people in different parts of the country could read the same news and buy the same products. Such basic concepts as time and distance took on new meanings. In fact, we got time zones thanks to the railroads. All right. They had to have specific times where they were supposed to be at a specific station. So we had to have time zones um, to account for that. In 1883, the railroads forced America to adopt its first national time zones. All right. People began caring more about what time of the day it was at this point. Think about it. Thousands and thousands of more Americans were working in a factory where you had to clock in, clock out. All right. Immigrants in the city, in New York City, for example, were working in the garment district, working in garment sweatshops. All right. Living by that clock, which is something and I all know all too well. All right. This is when that began to be more of a concern. Time. All right. Um, Compare that to how time was felt when people were artisans or farmers. All right. We looked at that a little bit earlier in the year, comparing farm life to Lowell factory life, Lowell factory life. The railroads accelerated the pace of the Industrial Revolution, right? So that market revolution that was planting the seeds and happening very slowly, planting the seeds of the Industrial Revolution, all right, went into hyperspeed after the Civil War. So all that division of labor, installation of machines, so on and so forth, um, really picked up speed after the Civil War. And then once the electrical grid was invented and factories could be electrified, even quicker. So new technologies such as machine building and iron and steel production advanced to meet the demands of railroad growth. By providing cheaper and faster freight delivery, the railroads helped create a new national market. Consumer goods such as clothing and cast iron stoves manufactured in the East and Midwest could be sold nationwide. All right, so again, transportation. All right, factories enabled railroads enabled the Industrial Revolution, which took place after the Civil War. A few large factories, mainly textile mills, had been operating in New England since the 1820s. Now, as the national market developed, businessmen invested in large factories around the country. Competition for markets grew fierce. Robber barons, quote unquote robber barons, such as Standard Oil's John D. Rockefeller, today it's different companies, but you would know mostly Exxon Mobil, is the old Standard Oil. They squeezed out smaller businesses and built corporations that would eventually overshadow even the railroads. Okay, they were called robber barons derogatorily by those who were critical of how wealthy and powerful they had become, and how exploitative they were in the minds of their critics, how exploitative they were of the common folk. A few businessmen profited greatly from the new economic system. Remember these names: railroad owners such as Cornelius Vanderbilt, Leland Stanford, some of the largest fortunes America had yet seen. And they used that wealth at the end of their lives to try and create the kind of charity they saw as uplifting to society. All right, like aren't they schools like Vanderbilt and Stanford? All right, so on and so forth. So they had kind of like in their view this enlightened charity. All right, similar to the way wealthy individuals today, like Bill Gates, will use his money to try and affect or change educational policy. Okay, things like that. All right, so standardized tests, PARCC exams, when you had the Common Core standards, those are all thanks to individuals using their money to influence educational policy, much the same way Vanderbilt and Stanford did over 100 years ago. The gaudy display of wealth by the newly rich led Mark Twain to label this the Gilded Age, right? And you'll be taking a video quiz on the Gilded Age, right? So it was this age of this totally unregulated Wild West of capitalism, where there were no rules, and a few at the top benefited, while a large portion of the people at the bottom did not. So gilded stands for anything that's kind of like golden on the surface, but if you kind of scratch at the surface, look a little deeper, it's not so nice. All right, so Mark Twain satirically referred to this as the Gilded Age. All right, guys, page 4, life and labor in the new world of industry. So the Industrial Revolution swept American society. In the words of one contemporary, like, quote, a muddy river in flood. Over the space of a few decades, countless jobs, once done by individual craftsmen, were integrated into the factory system, where labor on a product was divided into smaller tasks performed by many workers. Millions of Americans now faced new conditions of work and life. Working men and women were crucial to the growth of the railroads and the new industrial system, but they shared in few of its rewards. The money. Railway workers labored an average of 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sometimes they worked 16 to 20 hours without a rest. Their average wage was $2.50 a day. So they were losing their, again, standard of living and their independence and pay. All right. So this picture here you see on the left of page 4 would be a brakeman. And initially, they would have to climb outside the train and manually kind of couple every brake, like unlock it, so to speak. So eventually they could stop the train. It was a very, very dangerous job, right? And that's what ZEP was. We jumped off the train to start the strike. All right, so railroad work was difficult and dangerous. For example, brakemen coupled train cars by hand, often losing fingers in the process. When trains needed to stop, brakemen had to climb on top of each car to set the brakes. One slip could mean death. In 1889, the first year a count was kept, 2,000 railway workers were killed on the job and 20,000 were injured. Men and women in other industrial jobs faced similar hardships. Coal mining, with the constant threats of explosions and collapses, was even more dangerous than railroad work. Factories were cramped, dark, noisy, and hazardous. The machinery without safety features and no regulations regarding toxic materials or unhealthy conditions. So what you're seeing here is the effect of in the workers' minds, what unregulated capitalism does, right? To maximize profit, all right, they exploit the workers and have them work in unhealthy, unsafe conditions. So what you're going to see is the workers, factory workers, they become the first group of Americans to begin to advocate for the government to step in and regulate the business world more. All right. Not the last, but the first. So victims of industrial accidents received little or no compensation. For nearly all workers, whether or not they worked in the new factories, hours were long and pay low. The quality of housing, education, and healthcare available to workers was shockingly inferior, even by the poor standards of the era. The growth of large industry affected all Americans, and to many it seemed to threaten the nation's basic values of independence. Prior to the Civil War, small farmers and skilled craftsmen represented the essence of an American democracy and equality. This was what we discussed earlier in the year. In the ideal, quote, free labor system, working for wages was seen as only a temporary step towards owning one's workshop if you were a journeyman or a farm. Economic growth seemed to offer every man a chance to become his own boss. Again, women's opportunities remained much more restricted. This classical Republican vision of a community of productive, independent families inspired many Americans, especially in the North and the growing Midwest. During the Civil War, farmers, workers, and businessmen united to protect the free labor system against the slavery system. That was that free labor ideology. This free labor coalition built the Republican Party and filled the ranks of the Union Army. So prior to the Civil War and prior to the rise of big business, the largest group from which the Republican Party got their constituents was, your average worker, whether you were a farmer or an artisan. After the Civil War, the Republican Party will ally itself more with northern industrial businessmen. All right. And that's what we talked about towards the end of Reconstruction, right? So by the mid 1870s, however, the Republican coalition was splitting apart. Some businessmen supported the growth of large industrial corporations, but many working people, along with some small entrepreneurs, saw giant corporations squeezing out small businesses and workshops, and felt their dreams of independence slipping away. They feared the free labor vision was disappearing, meaning they would never escape from the factory or the wage system. Think back to how the Lowell workers reacted. Now it's happening on a national scale. Some farmers and middle class Americans also felt that their ability to shape their own lives was threatened. The railroads and other national corporations represented to them a new kind of power, distant, shadowy, irresponsible, and unaccountable, invisible. So last page, starvation in the midst of plenty. Last page of this video. From 1873 to 1878, America was struck by its first nationwide industrial depression. Unrest caused by unemployment and hunger would fuel the protests of 1877. The depression began when railroad owner Jay Cooke was found to have issued millions of dollars of worthless stock. So he caused the panic, investors panicked, and banks closed. The unbalanced, overextended new economy collapsed. The Depression affected Americans across the country. Families from Massachusetts to Missouri watched their children go hungry. Unemployment in New York City approached 25% in the winter of 1874. Nationally, millions were out of work. A Philadelphia worker wrote, quote, "Famine has broken into the home of many of us and is at the door of all," close quote. Meanwhile, despite the Depression, a small class of bankers, industrialists, and railroad owners continued to prosper. The federal government took no steps to end the Depression or alleviate the suffering it caused. Many Americans believed that government interference in the economy was wrong. Remember, laissez-faire. Misrepresenting Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection in evolution, some politicians, religious leaders, and reformers argued that the growing gap between rich and poor was inevitable. Following nature's law, to them, economic law demanded the strong be rewarded and the weak be eliminated. Even working people, influenced by free labor ideals, feared that charity would lead to dependence and moral decay. After the Civil War, and by the way, that was a sentiment that was true with every politician, every office holder, pretty much up until, or almost all of them, up until the New Deal. I mean, FDR was the first president to kind of break this laissez-faire mentality. All right, and the government became more hands-on. But even he was limited in the help he would give because he thought that if he helped too much, that it would lead to again, dependence and moral decay among Americans. It would ruin their self-esteem. Anyway, Last paragraph. After the Civil War, working people built the first large labor movement in America. Shoemakers, coal miners, iron molders, and other skilled workers organized by craft, by what they did, often on a local basis. But owners fought unionization, and white male trade unionists limited unions' potential strength by refusing to unite with African Americans, with women, and with unskilled workers. So the white skilled male worker shot himself in the foot um, by refusing to unionize with women, with unskilled workers, with African Americans. Because the truth about unions is that the more members exist within the union, the more powerful the union is collectively.